Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik with Figure It Out Productions. The following video is part of our Quick Shoot series.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and welcome to part 3 of my third video game generation retrospective. Part 1 was on the generation as a whole, and part 2 was on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Part 3 will be on the Sega Master System, one of the most missed and yet successful consoles of all time, so I will elaborate on that, of course. So this console is kind of interesting because Sega put it out in 1985 in Japan as the Sega Mark III. Now I don't have that particular version of the console, and they did so to compete with Nintendo's Famicom. Certainly if you wanted to explain how this console functions to most people, especially in North America, that's exactly what you'd say. It's like the NES, but it's like Sega's version of the NES. That's like the easiest way to put it. So that console, the Mark III, is kind of cool because it was backwards compatible with the SG-1000, which is a console, sadly, I do not own, and is another console that Sega put out in the third generation, though many years earlier. This is the Sega Master System that we eventually saw in North America and Europe. And I think part of the reason they changed the design probably had something to do with that, because there was no reason to have SG-1000 compatibility in this particular platform. However, since I don't actually have a Mark III, I can't really look at it and say like, oh, this part certainly wasn't necessary, that part certainly wasn't necessary, etc. I don't know, because I don't have it, so aside from that, it might have just been an aesthetics thing. They just thought, oh, okay, we can change it and make it look sleeker or something more badass. Interestingly, this console was re-released in Japan in 1987. Now, it saw its way to North America and Europe in 1986. It had very different stories in every region it was released in. In Japan, it was released and was incredibly lukewarm in its reception. It did okay at best. That would be a pretty liberal way of describing it, because it was okay at best. The Japanese version of the console, the re-release especially, came stock with what's called FM synthesis sound, meaning the game sounds were great. There's an old video by a YouTuber who's one of the biggest inspirations for why I even make YouTube content. His name is MN12Bird. He did a video comparing FM sound games on the Master System versus games without FM sound. Give it a listen. The sound quality is ridiculous. Now the Japanese units had that stock. In Europe and North America we didn't get that. However, the consoles can be modded for it, but it's kind of a pain in the ass. There are certain versions right here on the back. There's an expansion port. Now this one, just a big chunk of plastic. There's nothing I can do about it without really ripping it open and really working my ass off to get it in there. Now personally I don't have the skills anyway, so it doesn't really matter, but even if I had the modding skills, it would be painful on this one. Now there are versions of the console where it's simply plug and play if you buy the chip. You know, it's just how it is. From another technical standpoint, one thing this console did that's amazing, I mean amazing, is that it had RGB SCART from the get-go, day one. I want to put this in perspective, because RGB SCART is a video connection type. It's a cable. You plug in the back of the console and then you plug it in your television. Now in North America, that particular format is totally, literally foreign to us, because it was only available in other countries. We never had that in the US. I don't think Canada would have ever had it either. But in Europe, of course, it's standard. It's built into all the TVs. The video quality that comes from that, especially on a console like this, is mind-blowing. You have to remember, when this console came out, the standard was still RF. NES had composite, and even that was seen as like high-tech. Again, for perspective, that would be like if the PlayStation 2 had launched with an HDMI port in 2000. You know, it's just, they had built-in RGB SCART in 1986. The N64 didn't have that in 1996. It's just kind of like, wow, I can't believe they put that in there. And it was never even really utilized because we didn't have that format, nor did anybody in North America buy a Master System. Which is what leads me to my next point. The Master System was a colossal disaster in North America as far as sales go. Not saying it was a bad console, just saying that it had no chance. And Sega kind of knew that. And the reason it didn't have a chance is Nintendo had an iron, fucking an adamantium fist on the gaming industry at that point. They were so popular and so successful, and they had so many monopolistic business practices about other developers, they wouldn't allow developers to make games for their competition if they were going to make games for the Nintendo Entertainment System. I mean, imagine that today. That'd be like if Sony came out and said, all right, you're going to make games for the PS4, because the PS4 is selling the most units. You can't make games for the Xbox One, you can't make games for the Wii U. If you agree to make a game for the PS4, you can't do it for the other consoles. That is not necessarily legal, although at the time, that wasn't decided yet. So developers had no real chance of making games for this thing. And so Sega kind of knew that, and they took an interesting risk with that. They basically licensed out the console to Tonka. Yeah, Tonka. They make like toy trucks for kids and stuff. They basically controlled the Master System, and Sega controlled like the game development, although they put Sega's name all over it. I guess that made it easier because it was much easier for Sega to make money off the console, which ultimately they did, even though the console was not that successful here. Eventually they would buy back those rights, and I'll talk about that at the appropriate time. But yeah, so the console itself, very interesting. It has two controller ports, both DIN9 controller ports, the same ones you would see on the Sega Genesis. In fact, the Sega Genesis controller will work on here. The console also has an LED, of course. It has a pause button on the console. It wasn't on the controller. The controller looks much more like an NES controller, and it had a reset button, as well as, this is the thing that always kind of blows everyone's mind when it comes to the Master System. It had two different ways of playing games. It had a cartridge slot, and it had a HuCard slot. That's like what the TurboGrafx 16 uses. The other thing is, it had built-in games. You turn this thing on with no game in it, there will be games ready to go already, depending on what version of the console you have. This particular unit has Hang-On, Safari Hunt, and I believe Snake. I think all units had Snake, although you have to do like a special thing with the controller to make it work. But most units had some other games built in. This one, for example, has Sonic the Hedgehog 1 built in. This one has Alex Kidd in Miracle World built in. Meaning, again, you just turn the console on with no game in it, and you get a free game out of it. Granted, it's essentially a digital game, which I'm not a fan of, but it's still mind-blowing that they had that in 1986. So, there you go. Very, very neat. Also, from on the back here, what's kind of interesting to note is that yes, it had RF if you wanted it, but it also uses the same power supply that the Sega Genesis Model 1 or Mega Drive Model 1 used. It also has the same AV out port, meaning your RGB SCART cables or your composite cables, if you wanted to, for the Master System also worked on the Sega Genesis Model 1, which is really neat. And it gets even crazier when it comes to this whole backwards compatibility thing, like I said, with the Mark III. And they had, like I said, they had SG-1000 support. Now, interestingly, they left that in here. This is kind of hard to explain, but all the hardware for an SG-1000 that's required to make an SG-1000 game work is inside this console. But you can't fit the cartridge in there. There's no place to put it. However, if you take a Sega Master System EverDrive and load it up with the ROMs of an SG-1000 and put that cartridge in here and try to play them, it will work because all the hardware is in there. Strange decision, but it seemed to be how Sega had planned to do it, because when you got to the Sega Genesis, they put all of the hardware for the Sega Master System inside the Sega Genesis, but again, no cartridge slot. So that way you would either buy an adapter, or now we understand if you put a Sega Genesis EverDrive into a Genesis but load it with Sega Master System ROMs, it will work. Though interestingly, Sega SG-1000 ROMs will not work on a Sega Genesis. So somewhere along the line they made some sort of change that stopped that from happening. Obviously, like I said, it wasn't particularly successful in North America, mostly because the NES destroyed it. I mean, if you go to any retro game store here, you walk in, you'll see a bunch of NES games. You'll be lucky if you see any Sega Master System games, and if you do, it's usually the same couple of games. It's very, very rare to find any. We had a very small library of them here. I don't know the exact number, but we're talking maybe like 40 to 50. It was very small. Europe, though, totally different story. Europe was totally dominated, particularly the UK, because I've been to Europe a couple of times over the last couple of years, and in multiple countries I see Master System stuff, but nowhere more predominant than I did in the UK. In the UK, the Master System was like the NES was here. It was just so much more popular, and finding NES stuff there, almost impossible. You know, it really doesn't happen that often. It does, kind of, but you know, you go to a retro store there, you'll see walls of Sega Master System games, but you won't see NES stuff. And largely, that's because Sega went over there with the same basic idea Nintendo had, but they focused more on Europe than they did North America, because in Europe, Nintendo's iron fist or adamantium fist policies of developers not being allowed to make games or whatever didn't exist. That wasn't enforced over there. So as a result, there were shit tons of games they got in Europe that we never saw. So that is pretty fucking cool. And on top of that, the console is region free, which is nice as hell. So now let's talk a little bit about, I want to talk about some of my personal experiences with this particular console. Well, not this exact one, but okay, so when I was a kid, maybe I would have been 6 or 7, something like that. I had a friend named Matt, and he was one of those friends where you never go to their house, you just kind of see them at school. I'm sure you kind of know what I'm talking about. One time, only one time, I went to his house because my mom wasn't going to be home to pick me up or whatever from school, and so they said I could just stay at his house until she got home from work, which was I was really only there for a couple of hours. And at that point in time, everyone had an NES, an SNES, or a Genesis. Like, if it wasn't one of those three things, what the hell was it? And I remember being at his house, and we didn't really know what to do, because we didn't really hang out outside of school. And his dad just comes out and brings out this console. And he sits it down, hooks it up, turns it on, and I realized in hindsight what we were playing was Hang On, though I had no idea at the time. I did not know the name of this console. I did not recognize it at all. It happened to be this exact thing, this Model 1 Sega Master System. But for the life of me, I couldn't tell what the fuck it was. And every time I would ask him, times after we left, I would ask, what was that thing we played? He would just call it the Sega. Which I was like, no, it's not a fucking Genesis. What was it? Because you have to understand, I didn't know that Sega had made a console before the Genesis. No idea. And this is before the internet, so it's not like it was really particularly easy information to come by. So I was just, for years, just wondering, what the fuck did I play? I could always remember what it looked like, but I could not, for the life of me, find out the name of it. Anyone I talked to, anybody I described this to, they had no idea what the hell I was talking about. Again, because I grew up in North America, where the Master System was really irrelevant. So fast forward a few years, I want to say maybe like 97, I went to basically a toy show, something called the King County Toy Show, I think it was, which is something here in Illinois, in the Chicagoland suburbs. They did do every year. I don't know if they still do it. It's basically a big flea market or car boot sale if you're in the UK, where people just have tons and tons of items. Mostly in that particular case, they're focusing on toys, but you'll also see things like electronics and knickknacks and all that kind of shit. And I went there mostly to help my uncle because he was a toy salesman. And I was wandering around, and I came up to this booth that had, video games. And those are good places to get video games, by the way, because those, especially if they're focused on toys, not the games, they don't know what the hell to charge for the games, they don't really care about them as much. But anyway, so I walk up to this booth that has video games, and I'm seeing the usual stuff, Nintendo stuff, Sega Genesis stuff, and some PlayStation stuff at the time, very popular. And I see a boxed Sega Master System. But I remember being like, Matt. Like, I just recognized it. I recognized the fucking console that I had just been for years wondering what the hell it was. It was right there in the damn picture. Because this thing was boxed, complete, has the original styrofoam, everything. And I was like, so I asked the dealer, I'm like, okay, what is that thing? Give me information. I need to know things. What is it? And he was like, all right, kid. He was like, well, he did exactly what anyone would do who's trying to explain the Master System to someone in North America. He said, it's, so you know the original Nintendo? I was like, yeah. He's like, it's that, but Sega made their own before they made the Genesis. They made their own thing. It's like the same technologically, basically. I was like, what? It was finally being confirmed for me that Sega had made a console before the Genesis. And I know, by 97, they already had the Saturn out, okay? The Dreamcast was only a couple years away. But you have to remember, by that point in time, the only thing, I thought Sega had made the Genesis and the 32X and just vanished off the face of the earth at that point in time. I didn't know what the hell had ever happened to them. So the idea that they had made a console like the NES to compete with the NES before the Genesis absolutely fucking blew my mind. And to finally be having that story confirmed, to make sure I wasn't delusional, that I had imagined this story at Matt's house about this weird console I had never seen before. And it had Hang-On. That's the other thing. It had Hang-On. And I was like, that's the one I fucking played! I knew it! And I was so excited. I was like, oh my god, alright, fucking, how much is this? What do you want? And he was like, alright. He was like, $20. Which of course, jumped on. Box complete. I still have the box with the original styrofoam, everything. It came with, so I asked him if it had any games, and he said, no, I don't have any games, but it does have 2 built in. Built-in games? You remember, this console came out in 1986. And in 1997, that still blew my mind. Because that didn't happen. Consoles didn't just have games built in. Sure, consoles would come with a cartridge, sure, like pack-ins. But they weren't just, like, I can just turn this on with nothing in it, and there's games in there. Stock. That was surprising. So, yeah, he's like, it's got the 2 games built in, and, yeah. And I was like, alright, done, sold. I gave him a $20 bill, and I left with this thing. And I still have it. Now, the cool thing about this one in particular is that it has like this little sticker on it on both parts here to kind of, you're supposed to peel these off, obviously no one had ever done that because it still has them. I haven't taken them off either. There's still actually dust from the King County Toy Show underneath the sticker, which is kind of cool, but just to me. But yeah, anyway, so very, very cool that's how I got a Master System. And I remember bringing it home and hooking it up and playing the 2 games. I remember playing Hang-On and being like, holy shit, this is what I played at Matt's house. And it was cool. The other one was a game called, I have the cartridge for it right here. The other was Hang-On and Safari Hunt. Yes, I bought the cartridge years later. It's a super common cartridge, and I'd rather have the cartridge than just have the, shall we say, digital version. But this was essentially Sega's answer to the Mario Duck Hunt situation. I would have told them don't go with Hang-On, and that's from someone who loves Yu Suzuki and his work with Shenmue, etc. I never got the big deal with Hang-On. I would have told them to put Alex Kidd in Miracle World and Safari Hunt, because Alex Kidd in Miracle World is like a platformer. Hang-On is just a racing game. Safari Hunt is like Duck Hunt, except way better. I say that without any bias. Honestly, I love Duck Hunt, but Safari Hunt objectively is a better game than Duck Hunt. And it came with a light gun and everything, 2 controllers, all that shit. I remember being so excited about it. But of course, I live in North America. You couldn't find games for it. Anywhere. So I really just had those 2 games for a long time. Over time, I managed to get, obviously as you see, I got more games, I got more consoles. So I'll talk a little bit about that real quick. This one here is the Sega Master System 2. This is the European version. I want to say it was maybe like 2002, 2003. I started to miss Sega after the Dreamcast had kind of collapsed. I wanted to go back and see all the things I missed from their history. And one of the things I discovered was the Sega Master System 2. So I wanted to buy one, but the Sega Master System 2 in North America is extremely uncommon. Like, as uncommon as Model 1 is uncommon here, the Model 2 is infinitely more uncommon. And so I was like, alright, I was looking all over eBay and couldn't find one, but I found them all over the UK. I was like, alright, I'll just import one from the UK. And you have to understand, at the time, I had no idea that there were differences in power supplies. I had no idea there were differences in region coding, although in the case of the Master System there isn't any. I had no idea the difference between, video signals, like, that this thing had RF only, and that, PAL RF definitely won't work here. I didn't know the difference between 50 and 60 hertz, all that shit. I didn't know any of it. I just imported it. And it got here, and I couldn't get it to work, obviously, and I thought, well, it'll cost more to return than it's worth, so fuck it. I just held on to it. And years later, I had a friend of mine in the UK, ironically, I shipped it to him, he modded it for RGB SCART and shipped it back. So it actually has RGB SCART on board, it has composite on board, it has S-Video on board. Shout out to my buddy Raymond who did this modification. He put an LED in there so that I can see when it's on, because they stripped that out in the Model 2. So yeah, that's really nice. He also modded it so it switches between 50 and 60 hertz, which is really very cool. When they did this design, they did the kind of typical Nintendo design, which is they'll take the same console but strip out things they don't need. and just try to make it cheaper. So they stripped out the hue card port. They obviously took out the LED. They took out the RGB SCART, etc. Now, obviously, with the exception of the hue card thing, he put those back in there. But yeah. Now, eventually, I did get a North American version, as you can see here. I got this only a couple of years ago. I did a video on it when I got it. I was astonished to see it. This is the only the second one of these I've ever seen in North America, ever. The other one, this one right here, and I think my buddy Toy Rat in Canada has one, which is interesting because when you look these up on eBay, more often than not, if you're trying to find the North American version, it'll be sold in Canada, not the US. We did get it here, just apparently they got it more in Canada. I'm not really sure why. But it's very cool. Now this is interesting. You remember I said that Tonka had the rights to the Sega Master System. Eventually Sega bought those back so that they could make the Master System 2. By the time they made the Master System 2, they basically did it to recoup more money because the Genesis was so damn popular, Mega Drive, and so damn popular at that point that they thought, hey, you know, if we just kind of put this one out there with its own kind of re-release some of the backlog of games for it, you know, we might just make a big, you know, make a buck on our name. How well that worked out for them, I don't know. But yeah, in North America, it certainly didn't do shit. I'm kind of amazed they even released the Master System 2 in North America, but nevertheless, they did. Now I'd like to talk about some of the games I've got here. I already mentioned Hang On Safari, and I kind of talked about this hue card game, F-16 Fighting Falcon. Not a good game, but I just wanted to show you an example of a hue card game. Just looks like a TurboGrafx 16 game, basically. Some of the other games worth noting. Now, I should mention that I have more games than this. I'm just showing you a couple of examples. It's not that these are like the best games and fuck all the others or anything like that. It's just, I can't do everything. I can't list all the games. We'd be here all day. First one is Shinobi. This was considered one of the better games on the console, and of course had all sorts of sequels since then. This one's kind of funny for a few different reasons. Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. Yeah, this actually got a Sega Master System version. Now, infamously, this is a Sega Genesis game, but people don't tend to realize they had a Master System version of this. Now, it's also quite the rare game now. This is actually the North American version, which is even crazier. And on top of that, this game actually taught me a lot about Sega just by this little yellow part on the box. So I was looking at this, and it says, plays on Master System, Master System 2, Genesis with power base converter? What is that? And then of course I started doing research and found out, holy shit, there's a Master System 2. And holy shit, Sega released this adapter for the Genesis that lets it play all the Master System games. That's how we learned shit before the internet. It was like, oh my god, the box just taught me something. So yeah, I'm thankful to that game for that reason. When I was in the UK last year, 2014, at the time I make the video, I wanted to pick up at least one Sega Master System game because they have so many of them that we never got. So I was like, I have to get at least one. And I picked up Aladdin. Now, look at this cover art. Now, I loved this game on the Sega Genesis. I don't know how well the Master System version itself actually holds up, to be honest with you, by comparison. But it's just an example of like, yeah, you know, we got tons of games over there. This is the normal stuff you guys would have got, except you didn't actually get them. Look at the cover art of this compared to your typical North American game. It's just so much more inspired. Hell, look at this one. This was the pack-in. Look at that shit. They took it way more seriously over there. No one more seriously though than Brazil, which I'll talk about in a bit. Now, okay, so here's the other thing. The Sega Master System, a lot of people falsely credit it with being the birthplace of Sonic the Hedgehog. And the reason they do that is because, of course, it was the console that Sega made before the Genesis. And therefore, if there was a Sonic game on it, obviously Sonic started there. No, he started on the Genesis, and after he got super popular, they started releasing games for him on the Master System. Now, this was the only one that we got in North America. Sonic the Hedgehog 1. This was actually the last game released for the Master System in North America, which tells you how quickly it was cut short here, as you'll see in a moment. But yeah, so it got Sonic the Hedgehog 1. Now, this is not the same game you saw on the Genesis, which will make a little bit more sense in just a moment. In Europe, though, they got Sonic the Hedgehog 2. And if this cover art is starting to look familiar to you, there is a reason, which you might become very, very clear in just a moment. They also got Sonic Chaos. Now, if you know Sonic Chaos, you know that this was a Game Gear game. So here's the thing. The Game Gear, which was a handheld by Sega, the only real handheld they ever did, excluding things like the Nomad, was a Sega Master System in a completely different shell and then remarketed as a portable console to compete with the Game Boy. So a lot of games for the Game Gear were actually just Sega Master System ports. It's pretty much identical hardware. The only real difference was the Game Gear had a slightly higher color palette, but the Master System was capable of higher resolutions. So when they were making new Game Gear games, stuff that hadn't been on the Master System, in Europe and particularly Brazil, they would actually re-release those back onto the Master System. The hardware is so identical, there are actually Master System adapters for the Game Gear to let you play Master System games on it, which is just awesome, though I don't have any of those. Now those are the three more common ones, again, because this one came out in North America, and all three of these came out in Europe. But as you heard me mention a moment ago, the console was really popular in, of all places, Brazil, a country that we don't really talk about much when it comes to video games. It's just that, for whatever reason, when it comes to video games, the three dominant markets tend to be Japan, North America, and Europe. Sometimes you'll throw Australia in there, but they tend to get lumped in artificially with Europe for some damn reason, just because they're both PAL. But Brazil is a giant market that stands alone and is often completely ignored. However, in the Master System, that's a really difficult thing to do, because the Master System was insanely popular in that country. I mean insanely popular, to the point where it has kept going well beyond where it did it, even in Europe, where it was a dominant console. So they got things that nobody else got. For example, Sonic Spinball was released there. Now I only have this because for some reason, this was in a store in Portugal that I was in last year, and they had it, and so I bought it from them. But there's another one, there's Sonic Blast, which is the same Game Gear game, I guess, ported to the Master System. And the thing is, there's tons and tons and tons of games that were released in Brazil for not only the Sega Master System, but also the Sega Genesis, that the rest of the world never saw. So I want to leave you with this thought, because I only just learned this right before filming this video, and it fucking blew my mind. The Sega Master System was so popular in Brazil, a console that launched in 1985, believe it or not, has not yet been discontinued in Brazil. You heard that correctly. Sega officially still makes games and consoles for the Sega Master System in Brazil. So if you are from Brazil, you are single-handedly keeping Sega even artificially, to the best, that's like the best description you can call it, artificially, relevant to the console market. It's the only country where Sega is still doing anything officially in consoles. I mean, of their own hardware, of course. And, wow. You know what that means? It is actually the world's longest lasting console. That console has been active for more time than I have been alive, and has not slowed down, apparently. There are tons of games released there that the rest of the world will probably never see. And that is crazy. So that's it, guys. That's my thoughts on the Sega Master System. Please stay tuned to part 4, the final part of this series, which will be on the Atari 7800. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you all later.